Regime change, it's usually something we see in the movies, right? All dramatic, unexpected. But what happened in Syria, the fall of Bashar al-Assad, it feels like something straight out of Hollywood. Super swift, totally unexpected, and just sent shockwaves everywhere.
It really does. And I think what's so fascinating here is, this isn't just about a president losing power. It's a whole dynasty ending. Think about it. The Assads had a grip on Syria for, what, 5 decades? And now, poof, gone. After a decade of brutal civil war, too.
Yeah, it's wild. So we're diving into some reports on this whole thing, trying to figure out what led to this. Well, I guess pivotal moment is a good way to put it. And of course, what it all means for Syria going forward.
Absolutely. And the reports really paint this picture of a regime just crumbling. It's like internal weaknesses and all this external pressure. It just couldn't hold up. Like my house of cards, cities just falling to rebel forces. It doesn't even sound like there was much resistance.
And Assad himself fleeing the country. What a powerful image.
Right. Talk about a symbol of a regime completely falling apart.
So, okay, we've got these rebel forces, and the report mentions this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. They seem to be the major players here.
Yeah, HTS, powerful Islamist group, they led the charge working with other allies. But even for people who followed this whole conflict closely, the speed of it all was just shocking.
It makes you wonder, though, was it all just about rebel strength? Or was there something else going on that really weakened Assad?
Well, there's no doubt that years of war took a huge toll on Assad's regime. You've got attrition, economic strain, internal divisions. All of that weakens you. But the reports are pretty clear. Foreign involvement played a big role, too, both in how the conflict played out and in Assad eventually losing power.
And that's where it gets really interesting. Syria basically became this proxy battleground for all these international powers, each with their own agenda.
Totally. It's like a super complicated chess game, right? Multiple players all making these strategic moves, and the Syrian people are the ones who suffer.
So let's break it down. Who are the major players here?
Okay, well, on Assad's side, you've got Russia. They've been his main ally this whole time, providing military support, airstrikes, advisors, equipment, the whole 9 yards.
But even Russia, it seems like their support had its limits. I mean, they're pretty tied up with the conflict in Ukraine. You have to think that impacted their ability to back Assad as much as they might have wanted to.
Right, they definitely had other things going on, for sure. And then there's Iran, can't forget them. They saw Syria as this way to expand their influence in the Middle East, So they sent their own forces, boosted Hezbollah, really invested in propping Assad up.
But they've had setbacks too, right? I mean, Israel's been pretty active with airstrikes against Iranian targets.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They weren't without their problems, and that definitely limited what they could do in Syria.
Okay, so we've got Russia and Iran on Assad's side. What about the other side? The reports talk about the U.S., but it sounds kind of messy.
Yeah, the U.S. role is complicated. They were fighting ISIS, right? But then also backing certain rebel groups, and on top of that, supporting Kurdish forces in the north. So many moving parts. It's hard to say how effective they were.
And then, of course, there's Turkey. They've always been a major player in the region, and it seems like their focus was mainly on countering Kurdish influence along their border.
Exactly. Turkey was seriously worried about the Kurds gaining power, especially the groups they consider terrorists, so they ended up supporting certain rebel groups, which really shaped things in northern Syria.
And then there's the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others funneling money and weapons to anti-Assad factions, hoping to see him go.
Oh, for sure. They were definitely active players, too.
It's kind of a sobering reminder that Syria's fate hasn't really been its own, has it? All these outside forces with their own agendas, fighting this proxy war, and in the process, just devastating the Syrian people.
It's a real tragedy, no question. The conflict dragged on, the humanitarian crisis got worse, and it's hard to see how things could have gone any other way with all these outside forces pulling the strings.
Okay, so Assad's gone. But it wasn't just about the rebels or the international players, right? It was all of it together, all those weaknesses, all that pressure, just boom, tipping point. But now what?
Yeah, huge question. I mean, the report, it really highlights how massive this task is for Syria now. Rebuilding a country, I mean, it's been devastated by war, deep divisions everywhere, a humanitarian crisis, like off the charts. It's a really uncertain future.
It's hard to even know where to begin. I mean, the report talks about this political transition, right? Going from, what, decades of basically authoritarian rule to something, well, something democratic, something inclusive. But how?
It's the million-dollar question, seriously. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. This transition, it's not going to be easy, not after all the bloodshed, all the division.
Yeah, and the report mentions all these different factions, rebel groups, what's left of the old regime, all these different ethnic and religious groups. How do you even get them all in the same room, let alone agree on anything?
Right. It's almost like impossible to imagine them reconciling after everything that's happened. It's hard to even think of a historical example that's comparable.
I mean, are there any situations like this that give us some clue how this could play out?
Well, history's kind of mixed. When you look at transitions from authoritarian rule, some good, some not so good.
Hmm.
I mean, you look at South Africa, right? They went from apartheid to democracy. People called it a model transition. But it was super long, super tough, so many setbacks, compromises.
Okay, but then there's the Arab Spring. Some countries, like Tunisia, things seem, I don't know, relatively peaceful. But then you've got Libya, Yemen, total chaos, more violence.
Exactly. It's hard to predict. But there are some things we know matter, like setting up a government that's actually legitimate, everyone feels included, which means figuring out how to share power, making sure all the groups have a voice, building institutions people actually trust.
Easier said than done, I guess.
Yeah.
But okay, let's see you can somehow do that.
Yeah.
The report also talks about the humanitarian crisis. Millions of people displaced. And it's not just about providing food and shelter. Right?
Yeah.
You have to rebuild everything.
Yeah. It's a huge, huge undertaking. And honestly, the world can't afford to just ignore it. But I don't know, with all the geopolitical stuff going on, all the different interests, will the international community actually step up? Will they actually help?
It almost feels like Syria could become, what, like a forgotten crisis? Or get caught in the middle of some other rivalry and everyone forgets about the people suffering.
It's a real worry, for sure. And the needs are so big, so widespread, that it's going to take a lot of commitment from the international community, like sustained commitment, everyone working together.
Okay, so that's the humanitarian side. But then there's the security situation. Assad's gone, and that creates a power vacuum. The report talks about how easily that could be exploited. Extremist groups, I mean, that's a real concern, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Syria's been like a pressure cooker for, what, a decade?
Right.
All this pressure building
Yeah.
now. No Assad. It's like someone took the lid off and all that steam. Who knows what'll happen?
So how do you prevent the whole thing from blowing up? The report mentions this idea of creating a security force, but it has to be legitimate. It has to be neutral. But how do you even do that in a country that's so divided?
It's a tough one, no doubt. But you have to start somewhere. And I think that means addressing the root causes of the conflict. You've got to disarm all these militias, figure out how to integrate them into a national army. And that army, it has to represent everyone, not just one group, not just one faction.
And how do you build trust? How do you get people to believe in this army, to actually see it as representing them?
It takes time. And honestly, it takes a lot of work. It means building trust, promoting reconciliation, addressing all the grievances that fueled this whole thing in the first place.
That's a huge, huge task. I mean, the level of distrust, the animosity, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it is. But it has to happen. Because if there's no security force that people actually believe in, then Syria, well, it risks becoming a failed state, open to exploitation, open to more foreign intervention. The stakes are super high, not just for Syria, but for everyone in the region.
So we've got these three massive challenges: political transition, humanitarian crisis, security.
Yeah.
And they're all connected. It's honestly kind of overwhelming. But even with all that, even with all the chaos and uncertainty, the report, there's a little bit of hope in there.
Yeah, a little bit. Remember, the Syrian people, they've been through so much. But they're incredibly resilient. They've set up civil society groups, documented all the awful stuff that's happened, and they've kept hoping for something better. And now, without Assad, there's at least a chance. It might be fragile, but it's a chance to build a new Syria.
It's hard to wrap my head around all of this, I mean, we've talked about these huge challenges Syria faces, starting over without Assad. But it's like Syria is this geopolitical chessboard. And even though Assad is gone, the game isn't over, right?
Oh, not at all. I mean, yeah, maybe some of the players are rethinking their strategies, but the fight for influence in Syria, it's definitely not over. It's like, okay, imagine a chess game, right? One king is down, but all the other pieces, they're still moving around, trying to get the best position.
So what are the next moves then? What might we see happen on this geopolitical chessboard? We talked about Russia, how they were key in supporting Assad. What happens to them now?
Well, Russia's in a tough spot. They put a lot into Syria, both in terms of military stuff and politically, and they definitely want to see things stable there, at least stable in a way that works for them, right?
Yeah.
But they've got their own problems, especially with Ukraine, and that has to limit how much they can actually do in Syria.
I'm just trying to picture. Could Russia actually get more involved now? Try to fill that void left by Assad?
It's possible. I mean, they already have troops there, and they could easily step up their support, either for what's left of the Syrian government or even send in more of their own people. But that's a risky move.
Risky how? Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, if Russia gets more aggressive in Syria, it could really escalate things with, well, with other players,
Yeah.
especially the U.S. Remember, the U.S. is still there too, supporting their own groups, and they're not exactly thrilled about Russia's influence. So you could end up with a situation where the U.S. and Russia, these two huge global powers, end up in a proxy war. And guess where it happens? Syria.
Okay, that's scary. And what about Iran? They were really backing Assad, too. So what do they do now that he's gone?
I really doubt they'll just back off. Iran has its own goals in Syria. It's a big part of their whole Shia Crescent strategy, this land bridge that connects them to their allies in Lebanon. And it's a way for them to show their power in the whole region. So they'll probably keep supporting groups that align with what they want, and maybe even try to become the main power broker in Syria now that Assad's gone.
Okay, so you've got Russia maybe getting more involved. You've got Iran trying to step in. What about everyone else? Turkey, the Gulf states. How do their plans change now?
Well, for Turkey, the main thing is probably going to be security along their border and making sure there isn't a strong Kurdish presence in northern Syria. So they might keep supporting some rebel groups to help with that, maybe even try to create their own little zone of influence there.
Makes sense. And the Gulf states. They were really pushing for Assad to be gone. So now what?
It depends, really. It depends on who ends up being the main force in the opposition. They'll want to work with whoever shares their goals, especially when it comes to pushing back against Iran. It's hard to say for sure, though. Things are changing so fast, they'll probably adjust as they see what happens in Syria.
It's a lot to think about. Even with Assad gone, it feels like Syria is still in such a dangerous position. And it's easy to get caught up in all this talk about geopolitics and forget that real people are suffering because of all this.
Yeah, you're right. Millions of Syrians have gone through so much in this war, it's hard to even grasp it. People have lost everything, their homes, their families. And while we talk about these big power plays, we can't forget that the future of Syria, it's ultimately up to the Syrian people. Their resilience, their hope for a better future, that's what matters.
That's a good point. It's a reminder that even in the middle of all this chaos and tragedy, there's still, there's still hope.
Yeah.
So as we finish up this deep dive, what's the one big thing you want our listeners to really think about?
I think the biggest thing is that Syria's future isn't set in stone. It doesn't have to end in chaos or become some puppet state for a foreign power. The Syrian people, they have a say in this. They have their own vision of what they want, and they need our support as they try to build a new country.
That's powerful. It's a reminder that even in the face of all this suffering, there's still hope for something better. Well, thanks for walking us through all of this, for helping us understand the fall of Assad and what might come next for Syria. It's, it's been eye-opening, to say the least.
It was my pleasure, really. And just remember, things are changing in Syria all the time, so keep learning about it. It's a complex situation, and the more you understand, the better.